Imagine a single torch in the middle of a black valley, and an army scrambling away from it as if the very earth under their feet had become treacherous. How could 300 men turn the tide against thousands? The answer begins not with military genius, but with a trembling man hiding his grain, and with a voice that called him what he could not yet be: mighty warrior. For years the land lay bent beneath a silent, grinding oppression. Midianite bands swept across the countryside like a nighttime wind, tents arriving with the dark, flocks driven off before dawn, harvests stolen in a season when a family's bread depended on every head of grain. Villages emptied by week. People learned to sleep in caves and to eat what could not be seen from the road. The fields were scarred, the watchmen fewer each year, and a weary fear threaded itself into the bones of a people who once trusted God's protection. In one of those hidden places, under the low rim of a worn winepress, a man worked with his hands more from habit than hope. Gideon, son of Joaz, beat wheat in the hollow where a small ledge of rock cut off the view of the road. The press's shallow recess kept him from sight. He took the work because to be seen meant the loss of all he owned. The Midianite patrols would take the crop before he could bring it home. He wrapped his coat tight and listened, for hooves, for the scrape of a tent peg, for voices. When no sound came, he lifted his head, eyes still tuned to the slope that hid the path. His hands were calloused, his back bent, his speech low when he was with his neighbors. He called himself the least in his family. That's where the story starts. Not with a king in a palace, but with a farmer crouched in a shallow hole measuring how much courage he had left. A voice interrupted that small, furtive life. It came like a presence in the dim light, a calm that did not belong to the place, and it called him mighty warrior. Imagine the shock. A stranger seeing through the cheap, anxious label Gideon had accepted and naming him instead with a title of power. The words landed awkwardly in Gideon's chest. He answered the voice with the truth he knew. If the Lord is with us, why are we suffering? Where are the signs of rescue? What can I do? I am the least in my clan. His questions were not bluster. They carried the fatigue of a people who had no energy left for hope. What followed was not a lecture, but a summons and a sign. The messenger, an angelic presence, a figure the narrator calls the angel of the Lord in the ancient telling, spoke of tasks that seemed to contradict everything common sense required. Gideon was told to tear down his father's altar to Baal, to cut down the Asherah pole beside it, and to build an altar to the Lord in its stead, then to make an offering. It was a dangerous assignment. Baal worship was entrenched in the culture, and the man whose altar would be destroyed was no idle neighbor, but Gideon's own father, Joaz. To act would be to face shame, to risk conflict within his family, and perhaps to provoke more than neighbors' scorn. Gideon hesitated. He asked for a sign, not the arrogant challenge of one sure in his own strength, but the humble plea of someone who could not yet believe his own life could be a vessel of divine action. That sign was given in a moment the telling preserves with a kind of holy stillness. Fire from heaven consuming the offering. The flame did not come as a demonstration of showmanship, but as confirmation, a thin line between the ordinary and the sacred. The smell of burnt grain and lamb hung in the air long after the embers died. For Gideon, that smell was the scent of a promise made credible. For others, it was an offense. Gideon obeyed. In the dark of night he crept to his father's high place, the stones of the altars slick with the histories of local worship, and he took a rock and smashed. He cut down the Asherah pole. He wrapped a new altar with his trembling hands and offered what little he had on it, praying with words half-formed, heart pounding in the quiet. And though fear accompanied each motion, fear of man, fear of reprisal, fear of failure, his obedience lit a new kind of light among the people. There is always something contagious about a brave, even a fearful act of faith. It announces that the story might be different now. Not everyone received it kindly. The priests of Baal were angry. Some in his town murmured. His own father, Joaz, confronted him in a voice that mixed shame and bewilderment. Yet others watched, and the watching seeded courage. Word moved like a river widening, first a trickle, then a current. People who had only murmured prayers and wishes now stepped forward with voice and sword and hope. Men who had been hidden by the caves began to gather. The rumor of a man who struck down an idol and offered to the true God spread like a spark in a dry field. Soon 32,000 men came, armor and anger and longing mixed together. They came because they had a memory of a people with God, because oppression had finally become too heavy. They came with promises and with attendant faults, some drawn more by the prospect of plunder than by faith, others still clinging to old resentments. Gideon stood at the head of a swelling throng that felt like the first breath after a long illness. But into that moment came another voice, quiet and decisive. The Lord said, "You have too many men." It was not a tactic of scarcity, but a theological correction. God's purpose was to make plain that the victory should belong to Him alone, so that Israel could not boast that it was by their own arm that they were saved. It must have felt like a knife in the hope of the people. Why would God ask for fewer men when the enemy had thousands? But the question itself pointed to a central truth of this narrative. God will sometimes remove visible strength so that His hand becomes unmistakable. Imagine Gideon looking out at the mass of faces, each carrying years of hurt and a hunger for relief, and hearing that they must be pared down. He did not revel in the cutting. He permitted it because his trust was not in numbers but slowly, becoming rooted in the one who had sent the sign. First came a hard culling. Those who were afraid turned back. They returned to their homes, their caves, their unable to sleep nights. 22,000 left, and Gideon was left with 10,000. The departure of the fearful was not a mark of blame. It was a recognition of human limits. Courage is not a commodity that can be ordered up. It is a gift that some hold and others cannot at a particular hour. It was precisely that raw human frailty that would make the forthcoming victory look unmistakably like God's work and not a human triumph. But even 10,000 was too many for the purpose at hand. God, in His inscrutable wisdom, set another test, not to humiliate the strong, but to reveal a particular quality in the men who would stand with Gideon. They were gathered at a spring of water. The scene was ordinary. Men tired from march and hunger, faces darkened by dust and sweat. The comforting call of cool water. Yet how each man drank would be the criterion. Some kneeled and cupped water to their mouths with both hands. Others brought water to their lips in their palms and lapped like dogs. Those who cupped with their hands were judged less watchful, less ready for the suddenness of battle. Those who lapped with their hands to their mouths, pausing, vigilant, keen to drink without losing awareness of their surroundings, marked themselves as different. Only 300 lapped. The rest were sent away. The number itself startled those who applied human calculation to the problem. 300 against a swarming host? It seemed absurd, almost intentionally absurd. But the test did not aim to make military sense. It aimed to sharpen the fact that deliverance would come through something other than conventional strength. The men who remained were not necessarily the bravest by temperament, but they were the most attentive, the kind who could read a night wind for danger and, in the dark, notice the shift of a shadow. Gideon felt the cut in both his flesh and his faith. He had urged some to stay, relieved when others joined, secretly soothed by the swelling ranks. Now he watched the numbers thin to what seemed a sliver of hope. The reduction exposed a private fear in him. Did these signs mean he was called to a triumph beyond what any man could accomplish? He prayed again for confirmation, for the Lord to stand by his smallness and make it a stage for divine power. In that season of testing he remained very human, anxious, perhaps even wavering, but obedient. When God's method appeared strange, he did not refuse. There is a quiet moment in the narrative where fear and obedience meet at the edge of a cliff. The men who remained were not polished warriors. They carried with them the smell of the village soils and the memory of stolen harvests. Yet they had something else. A certain alertness of spirit, a readiness to act on a word that might sound foolish to the world. To them, the Lord's presence was more important than the illusion of safety that comes from numbers. As they camped at the edge of the valley, the mood among the 300 was a mixture of expectation and dread. Some told stories of the consuming fire at Gideon's offering. Others spoke in low tones of the horrible raids they had seen. In the hush between talks, The wind carried a metallic tang, a sense that the night could be a curtain between the known and the miraculous. The commander among them, the same man who had once counted himself the least, now felt the weight of leadership like a stone in his chest. He had learned to accept that God's ways would often confound common sense, and that obedience carried costly risks. Before the men took their positions, Gideon gathered them in small knots beneath the stars. He did not promise invincibility. He did not offer slogans. Instead, he spoke to them of one thing: trust in the Lord. He reminded them of the smell of the burnt offering that had unfurled hope, of the fact that they had endured tests that stripped away human confidence, that God had chosen those who were watchful in a world that had taught them otherwise. He asked them to hold their place when the moment came, to do what they were told quickly, without seeking glory or delay. There is a particularly human texture to Gideon's leadership here. He was not a polished general. He was a man who had been called into a role that frightened him. His voice at times trembled on the old edges of doubt, and at times steeled as he called the men to stand. The men listened, not because they believed in any doctrine about their leader, but because they had seen a sign and because their lives demanded a cause. They knew the cost of staying hidden and the cost of trusting. That knowledge made them strangely ready. In the valleys below, the Midianite camp lay like a sleeping tide of tents. Fires burned low. Men laughed with the reckless ease of those who think themselves secure. In the dark, Gideon's small company waited. They were given strange implements for what lay ahead: trumpets, small clay jars, and torches. The implements felt like something out of a parable, simple, even humble, and crafted for a purpose that would confound any conventional plan. Soldiers snatched swords and shields. Here were fragile pots and the sound of a horn. The incongruity was purposeful. One could almost hear, in the silence of that waiting, the narrative's lesson taking shape. God's instruments are often the ones we would never pick. Gideon's mind turned to the possible outcomes. He remembered the signs, the consuming fire, the soundness of the test at the spring. He remembered the departure of the fearful and the men whose manner of drinking testified to their readiness. He thought of Israel's prayers, the tears of mothers who had lost sons to raids, the stolen lambs and burned stores. Each memory was a weight and a fuel. He knew that whatever happened, the result would not be only about who lived or died that night. It would be about the way God revealed himself to a people long wearied of silence. As the men took their positions, the valley breathed around them. The whisper of olive trees, the distant bleat of a startled goat, the low, confident snore of a camp trusting its numbers. Night had a way of magnifying small things. A single torch could become a beacon, a single sound an omen. This is the place where the narrative holds its breath. A tight, loaded moment before action, where faith and fear are coiled together like a spring. The question that the story has carried from Gideon's winepress to this ridge is simple and urgent. Who will take the first step of obedience when it looks like folly? The answer will come in the form of commands, broken jars, and trumpet blasts. But not yet. For now there is only waiting, and the men's faces, lit by tiny lights, are set like flint against the dark. Gideon stands among them, a leader who once called himself least, and the whole scene feels like a fulcrum. If God moves, a nation swings. If God does not, the moment dissolves into yet another sad recounting of what might have been. At that edge, people's old habits press close. Quick calculations, the urge to flee back to the caves, the temptation to think the sign in the rock was a private wonder, not a call to transform history. Gideon, who had already broken down an altar and offered a burned gift, now must ask his 300 to be instruments of a plan that will look ridiculous to any passing observer. He must ask them to trust that God's glory, not human strength, will decide the outcome. Their readiness to accept that, their willingness to take simple objects and place them in God's hands, is precisely the condition by which the story will show who God is. Even before the first jar shatters, something has already been accomplished. The people who had covered their children and hidden their grain are seeing a different picture of themselves. Not merely victims, but possible participants in deliverance. Yet the narrative remains honest about the human cost. The victory, when it comes, will not be a crown of unblemished righteousness. It will be messy, complex, and followed by consequences that will test the people's fidelity. Gideon himself will be a flawed instrument. There will be memory and also missteps. But such complexity only deepens the point. God's methods will often confound our expectations, and his hand chooses frail things to make his power visible. As the men hold their breath beneath the stars, the valley seems almost to listen. Somewhere in the stillness, the scattered sounds of the enemy camp carry like a far-off echo, a shout, the scrape of a tent flap, laughter that will be broken in a few hours by terror. Gideon touches the jar at his side, feeling the grit beneath his nails and the brittle sound a pot makes when it fractures. The trumpet in his hand feels like a summons. To wake, to shout, to begin a kind of liturgy of deliverance. The torches, wrapped in their clay, are tiny suns waiting to be revealed. There is a moment at the edge of action where courage is not yet proven and bravery is not yet praised. That moment is the heart of the paradox in the title. How could 300 men defeat thousands? The narrative has already laid its groundwork. A people oppressed, a man called in the dust, a sign of fire, an altar torn down, 10,000 reduced to 300 by tests that revealed watchfulness and dependence. Now the men hold implements that make no sense to strategy but make perfect sense to a God determined that deliverance not be mistaken for human conquest. Gideon's last glance toward the east finds the faintest glimmer of dawn. He remembers his father's face when the stones were broken, the way the smell of smoke settled over the village like a promise or a warning. He thinks of the priests of Baal, their anger a small human thing that will not stop the larger movements of history. He thinks of the 300 with their hands calloused from work, men who had drunk grainy water and walked through humiliation to stand here. He thinks, too, of the fragile line between faith and presumption, the very thing that will be tested in the night. The plan, when it is finally whispered in the dark, will sound improbable. It will require that each man do a single thing at the appointed time, neither stealing credit nor breaking formation. But that plan belongs to the next hour, the next breath, the next beat of a nation leaning forward. For now, the quiet holds the men like a chord ready to be struck. The scene pauses on the cusp of action. Small lights, the brittle sound of clay against stone, a trumpet poised. Outside the encampment, unseen by the enemy, 300 watchful men wait for the word that will set them to move. When the word finally came, it moved through the 300 like a pulse, a single low command, measured and exact. Men tightened their grips on trumpets and jars. Torches that had been hidden inside the clay waited like coals beneath a lid. The valley held its breath. The enemy camp slept, confident in its numbers. Night wrapped around the tents, and the smell of cooking fat and careless laughter floated up and away from the sleeping host. The plan itself was a whisper of audacity, not a roar of strategy, but a divine contrivance meant to unmask who really held power. If this story is speaking to you, if the thought of ordinary people used by God stirs something in your chest, subscribe to the channel and stay for more stories like this. Gideon divided his men into 3 companies, each a string of watchful faces and small, fragile instruments. They slipped down the ridge like shadows, moving in silence across the cold stone, the clay jars clicking faintly against leather straps. Each man knew his cue. None sought a headlong clash. The command would be precise. Raise the trumpet, break the jar, show the torch. In that singular moment, the valley would be lit with hundreds of tiny suns, and sound would multiply like thunder. The first sound was almost absurdly small, a sudden clear blast from a trumpet that cut the night like a bright cord. Then the jars shattered, and with the breaking came light. Torches revealed, small fires held aloft like beacons. The noise that followed did not come from the Israelites alone. From the enemy camp came the startled cry of men whose sleep had been stolen. The darkness became confused by light and sound. Horses galloped in wild loops. Men flung on mail and rushed from tents in half-dressed confusion. The trumpet blasts multiplied, 300 notes, sharp and synchronized, and the sight of lights like 1,000 stars appearing from the bodies of those who had been invisible until then made the camp feel surrounded by a multiplying, impossible force. Chaos is a particular kind of terror. Armies trained to order rely on clear sight and known signals. When light appears all at once in a place it was not expected, when sound comes in strange choruses and fragile pots lie shattered like evidence that the world has gone wrong, panic spreads faster than any soldier can command. Midianite ranks, thick and secure by daylight, unraveled in the dark. Men who believed their numbers could protect them found themselves thrown into a crowd that pushed and stumbled, where trumpets were mistaken for running signals and torches like distant columns of an approaching host. Witnesses later would say they could not distinguish friend from foe in the din. The Midianites, in confusion, turned on each other. Soldiers fled in every direction, trampling their own, stumbling into tents, cutting throats as they mistook comrades for attackers. It was not mere rout, it was the collapse of a sense of reality itself. The night sounds, the brittle shattering of clay, the keening cry of those who thought themselves betrayed by sleep, the clamorous call of trumpets, became instruments of fear more effective than iron. Gideon's men did not linger to gloat. At the signal they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The cry was short, fierce, and singular in its intent. They surged forward, not as a vast army, but as a focused force following a sudden opportunity. In the dark confusion, the enemy fled. Some were cut down on the spot, others threw away tents and fled into the open valley, where the sudden light and noise multiplied their terror. The once numerous host became a scattering mass. The heart of the miracle is not that clay jars or trumpets are themselves powerful, but that God used them to expose his presence. He turned a world accustomed to counting strength into one that had to reckon with the uncanny. The victory was not explained by human wisdom. It was explained by a God who had chosen to act through things that looked helpless. In the aftermath, the testimony that rippled through Israel was not a manual for warfare but a proclamation. The Lord had saved them. The night did not end at the breaking of jars. The rout became pursuit. Gideon called the blow of alarm, and the surrounding hill country rose in reaction. Men of Israel ran after the fleeing Midianites. Some pursued by way of the passes, others cut off the roads of escape. Those who had once hidden in caves now found themselves running with the eagerness of a people reclaiming life. In the chasing, they captured 2 men of command, Zebah and Zalmunna, chiefs among the Midianite leaders. Their capture signified not just military success, but the moral collapse of the oppressor. Leadership exposed, surrounded, and taken. The taking of Zebah and Zalmunna was neither theatrical nor needlessly cruel in the telling. It marked the end of immediate terror for many villages. The captives were marched back through the places that had known raids and emptied larders. In each town their sight caused a breath to be taken by those who had lived beneath a shadow. Women who had sown in darkness stepped onto doorways. Men who had kept watch for strangers lowered their spears. The joy was palpable, a relief that tasted like bread. Yet the narrative does not hide the human cost. Many had died, many remained scarred, and the land would need time to heal. On returning to the towns, Gideon faced human responses that were not purely grateful. He arrived at Succoth and Penuel seeking help and lodgings, and the people there denied him, perhaps fearful of retaliation, perhaps nursing old grievances. Their refusal stung. Gideon, who had shown mercy to the people when they were oppressed, now found the hard calculus of leadership demanding a judgment. He vowed a punishment. He promised that those who refused to help would be made to feel the burden of their choice. Later, when the fleeing Midianites were taken and the spoils distributed, Gideon did indeed execute a sentence on those cities, compelling Succoth and Penuel to suffer tasks and to bear consequences. The narrative treats these actions soberly. They are part of the messy aftermath of war, not a pageant of revenge. Leadership sometimes carries a necessary firmness, and the story records both compassion and consequence. The spoils of battle, however, brought a different danger, one that would prove more dangerous than any external foe. From the wealth that came with victory, Gideon made an ephod, a vestment of significance. It was meant at first as a memorial, an object to remind the people of the hand of God in their rescue, a piece of fabric that would stand as tangible testimony to what had happened. In a fragile economy of symbols, an ephod could bind memory to ritual in a way words sometimes cannot. But memorials can calcify into idols. In the making of the ephod, The line between remembering and worshiping blurred. The people began to treat the ephod not as a reminder of God, but as a thing to depend upon in place of God. They worshipped the symbol. What was intended to point the nation to faith became, through human inclination and the seductive nature of tangible tokens, an object of idolatry. Gideon, who had acted from a place of fear and obedience, found his own household legacy complicated by what came afterward. The story pauses here with a sober warning that victories can be garlanded into idols if the people are not vigilant, and that human leaders, even those faithful in one moment, are capable of misjudgment. The nation enjoyed peace for a season, decades in which the raids diminished and fields could breathe again. Gideon lived to see a respite, and in his lifetime Israel experienced stability that had been impossible during the time of Midianite preeminence. But longevity of peace is not proof of spiritual fidelity. When Gideon died, the people once more slipped into the rhythms of their own choosing. The greater drama of Israel's history continued. The next generation did not always carry the memory of God's acts with purity. One of the most tragic threads to follow from Gideon's life is the story of his son, Abimelech. Abimelech's rise is a picture of how a family's success can be warped by ambition. He bargained for power, turning to his mother's kin and to local chieftains with silver to make himself king. In a brutal act, he killed his brothers, sons of Gideon, save for the one who escaped. His rule, though short-lived, was filled with violence and ultimately met a violent end. The narrative's postscript is stark. A leader who had delivered his people from an external menace could not secure the moral heart of his own house. Victory does not guarantee virtue in descendants. Success can be followed by tragic moral failure, and family loyalty does not always follow the line of divine calling. The story of Gideon closes in a mixed register, triumph and warning braided together. He had been the least in his clan, and yet God used him to accomplish a deliverance that reshaped the nation for a time. He had been given signs and had obeyed in ways that cost him family peace and placed him in danger. But he also yielded to human tendencies, creating a memorial that became an idol, and leaving a legacy that allowed ambition to fester in his line. The conclusion is not simple heroism. It is a sober portrait of how divine work and human weakness coexist. There are several lessons that emerge clearly from this story, and they are practical for any time in which the faithful find themselves outnumbered by fear. First, God often chooses the unlikely. The instruments here were a farmer hiding grain, fragile clay jars, and a few trumpets. The point is not that any small thing will automatically become miraculous, but that God does not require the trappings of human might to reveal his power. When we count our limitations honestly, we make space for God to be glorified rather than for us to boast. Second, obedience matters more than numbers. The reduction of Gideon's force was not a punitive measure, but a theological one. Victory should be attributable to divine action, not human accumulation. The qualitative test at the spring, the watchful men who lapped, highlighted character over count. In our own lives, being faithful in small, attentive ways may be the more decisive factor than amassing visible strength. Third, beware of post-victory idolatry. The ephod is a cautionary emblem. Tangible reminders can become replacements for the living God. After success, communities are tempted to create objects, systems, or narratives that redirect worship from God to the memory of success itself. Vigilance is required to keep gratitude from calcifying into dependence upon tokens. Fourth, leadership is fallible and legacy is fragile. Gideon's story shows that a leader can be used mightily by God and yet make choices that harm the future. The cost of leadership includes the responsibility to guard not only against external enemies but against internal corrosion, pride, opportunism, and the seduction of power. These lessons are not guidelines for guaranteed outcomes. They are meditations on how the divine and the human intersect in history. They invite us not to a formula, but to a posture. Humility that trusts, obedience that is costly, and accountability that recognizes human weakness. Imagine again that single torch in a dark valley. Its light is not simply a technique. It is a visible sign that where God moves, the world's calculations may be upended. The 300 men were not alone because of their weapons, but because the Lord chose to act. That is the paradox the title points to. How can 300 defeat thousands? They do so when the invisible author of history steps into the scene and turns fragility into spectacle. The true scene of the victory is not merely physical, but spiritual. God's glory set against human despair. Yet the story asks us to remember the other half of the picture. Deliverance can be followed by forgetfulness. Memory can harden into idolatry. Sons can become tyrants. Redemption does not suspend moral consequence. Gideon's life invites us to celebrate deliverance without mistaking it for arrival at moral perfection. The call is to watchfulness, for ourselves, our symbols, and our children, so that the work God does among us might bear fruit that endures. Before we close, a quiet prayer. Lord, give us courage like Gideon when hiding seems safer than acting. Give us eyes to recognize your call and hands ready to obey even when the request sounds foolish to the world. Guard us from turning your gifts into gods, and keep our hearts humble when you bring victory. Help our legacies to honor you, not ourselves. If this story encouraged you, share it with someone who needs to hear that God can use the unlikely. Watch the 2 videos recommended on screen now to explore more stories of faith and obedience, and join us next time as we look at another moment where God chose the small and made it great. Remember the torch in the valley and ask, where might God be asking you to trust Him with what seems too small to matter?